Breathe slowly. You are in a place where nothing is asked of you. Let what was holding start to soften now. And now we begin. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is a psychological state the brain has to learn to enter. Research in auditory neuroscience distinguishes between acoustic silence, the absence of external noise, and psychological silence, the quieting of the brain's internal narrative. Most people never reach the second kind because the default mode network continues generating inner speech, emotional replays, and anticipatory thought even in perfectly quiet rooms. Studies have found that the brain's response to silence is not neutral. It is an active, trained state, one that correlates with reduced cortisol and increased parasympathetic activation. Psychological silence, the kind that actually rests the nervous system, is a skill before it is a sensation. Tonight begins there. Your brain doesn't simply go quiet when the room does. Internal auditory experience, the voice in your head, the mental replay of conversations, the soundtrack your mind generates before sleep, is neurologically distinct from hearing external sound, but activates many of the same circuits. Brain imaging studies using fMRI show that inner speech engages Broca's area, the left inferior frontal gyrus, and the supplementary motor area, the same regions involved in planning spoken language. This means that when you try to fall asleep in a quiet room, your brain is not resting. It is preparing to speak a language no one else can hear. Understanding this is the first step toward not being controlled by it. Never experiencing silence carries a measurable biological cost. Chronic noise exposure, including self-generated mental noise, keeps the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in a low-grade activation state. The HPA axis is the body's central stress response system, and when it stays activated even at a modest level, cortisol remains elevated, the immune response is suppressed, and restorative sleep is impaired. A landmark study conducted in 2013 found that 2 hours of silence per day in mice promoted the development of new neurons in the hippocampus, the brain region most associated with memory consolidation and emotional regulation. The brain does not just tolerate silence. It grows in it. Fear of silence is a measurable trait studied in relation to anxiety, hard-head, and avoidant attachment. Researchers call it intolerance of silence. People who score high on this trait tend to fill quiet environments reflexively, with screens, podcasts, background television, or music, not because they enjoy these inputs, but because silence triggers an orienting response the nervous system interprets as a signal that something important is being missed. The absence of sound reads, neurologically, as an alert. What is remarkable is that this intolerance can be measured and tracked, and that it reliably decreases with deliberate, quiet practice over time. The nervous system learns what it is given the chance to learn. The orienting response to silence is evolutionarily ancient. In most mammalian species, sudden silence in an environment that was previously noisy serves as a danger signal. It means that animals nearby have stopped moving, which often means a predator is present. This threat detection reflex is encoded in the amygdala and processed faster than conscious thought, within milliseconds of silence onset. In modern humans, this ancient circuit still fires. When the room goes quiet, a primitive part of the brain scans for threat before the prefrontal cortex can evaluate whether any threat actually exists. What feels like discomfort with silence is often the amygdala doing its job. Meditation traditions that have long prescribed silence as a healing practice were, without knowing it, describing the neuroscience of parasympathetic activation. The vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in the body, running from the brainstem through the chest and into the abdomen, is the primary conduit of the parasympathetic nervous system's rest and digest response. Silence activates vagal tone. Research has found that passive acoustic rest, simply sitting in quiet without any task, was more effective at reducing heart rate variability and increasing vagal tone than listening to relaxing music. The body has always known how to use silence. The mind is still catching up. There is a phenomenon called the psychological refractory period, and it applies to thought as much as to physical reflex. When the brain is processing one stimulus, it has a measurable delay, typically between 200 and 500 milliseconds, before it can fully process a second one. In constant noise environments, incoming stimuli stack before they can be processed, creating what researchers call cognitive overload. Silence interrupts this stack. In the absence of new inputs, the brain can finish what it started. That completion happens most efficiently in quiet wakefulness and in the early stages of sleep. Silence is not emptiness. It is completion time. The default mode network, first mapped comprehensively by Marcus Reichel at Washington University in 2001, is most active when the brain is not engaged in external tasks. Rather than switching off during rest, it generates the brain's autobiographical self, the continuous inner narrative. This narrative tells us who we are, what we've experienced, what we anticipate. In people with anxiety and depression, the DMN shows hyperactivity. It runs louder than normal, producing more rumination, more self-referential thought, more imagined threat. Quiet practices that reduce DMN dominance, including meditation, contemplative walks, and silence, have been shown in fMRI studies to reduce the cortical thickness of regions linked to chronic worry. Something well documented in cognitive science is the relationship between silence and creativity. Research published in 2006 introduced the theory of unconscious thought, the idea that complex decisions and creative connections are made more effectively when the conscious mind is not actively engaged. In silence, and especially in the hypnagogic state between waking and sleep, the brain shifts into a diffuse processing mode associated with insight. Thomas Edison famously tried to harness this state by napping in a chair holding steel balls. As he drifted, the balls would drop and wake him, catching the hypnagogic moment. The ideas that arrive in quiet often could not have arrived in noise. Psychological silence has a measurable signature in the nervous system, and that signature changes over time with practice. In novice meditators, EEG studies show increased alpha wave activity within 5 to 10 minutes of sitting in quiet, a shift away from the high-frequency beta activity associated with alert, effortful thinking. In long-term meditators, this shift occurs faster and reaches deeper theta wave states without the person falling asleep. What this means is that the brain's access to silence is trainable. The nervous system can be taught to interpret absence of noise, of input, of demand, not as a threat to scan, but as a resource to draw from. That training is what tonight builds, one fact at a time. Acoustic ecologists, scientists who study the relationship between living organisms and their sonic environment, have identified a category called natural silence, distinct from man-made quiet. In truly natural environments with no human-generated sound, the soundscape consists of what Bernie Krause calls the geophony, biophony, and anthrophony. When anthrophony, the human component, disappears, the remaining soundscape produces a specific physiological response: reduced respiratory rate, lower cortisol, and increased skin conductance stability. A 2017 study in Scientific Reports found that even brief exposure to a natural soundscape recording, 15 minutes, produced measurable reductions in amygdala activation. The brain does not experience all silence the same way. It responds differently to the quiet of the natural world. Among the world's quietest rooms is an anechoic chamber in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a space so silent it measures below the threshold of human hearing. People who enter it begin to hear their own biology within minutes: the sound of blood moving through veins, the faint pulse of the heart, the subtle crackling of the ear's own mechanical processes. Most people find it difficult to remain for very long. What this reveals is something important. The fear of silence is, in part, a fear of hearing oneself without distraction. An absolutely silent room doesn't empty the world. It amplifies what is already there. Solitary confinement research has produced some of the clearest evidence of what happens when silence is imposed rather than chosen. In studies of prisoners held in sensory-restricted environments, researchers, including Stuart Gracian at Harvard, documented a specific psychiatric syndrome: perceptual distortions, hypersensitivity to minor stimuli, anxiety, and in some cases, auditory hallucinations. The brain generating its own sound to fill the void. Crucially, this syndrome did not occur in individuals who chose solitude and silence voluntarily. The same absence of external input that causes psychological distress under coercion produces restoration under choice. Chosen silence is neurologically different from imposed silence. The prefrontal cortex's sense of agency changes the entire biological response. Mindful silence, the intentional act of sitting with quiet without trying to escape it, activates the anterior insula a brain region associated with interoceptive awareness, or the ability to notice the internal state of the body. The anterior insula is involved in emotional regulation, empathy, and the sense of being present in one's own body. People with high interoceptive awareness tend to have lower anxiety, better emotional resilience, and faster recovery from stress. Research published in 2020 showed that 8 weeks of mindful silence practice increased insular cortex gray matter density, a physical change to the brain from simply learning to sit with quiet. The body thickens where the attention rests. An intense emotional reaction to specific sounds, a condition researchers call misophonia, is understood in part as a disorder of sound-to-silence contrast sensitivity. The brain of a person with misophonia is not simply more reactive to sound. It has an unusually strong association between certain trigger sounds and the brain circuits responsible for threat response and disgust. Neuroimaging studies from Newcastle University, published in 2021, found structural differences in the anterior insular cortex of people with misophonia compared to controls, the same region that mediates interoceptive silence. What this suggests is that the experience of sound and silence are neurologically inseparable. Silence is not the absence of misophonia. It is the place where misophonia rests. Children raised in chronically noisy environments, near airports, busy highways, or in homes with constant background media, show measurable differences in cognitive development compared to children raised in quieter environments. A longitudinal study published in Psychological Science in 2005, following children near a Munich airport before and after its relocation, found that noise exposure was associated with lower reading scores, poorer working memory, and higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol. When the airport moved, children's cognitive performance improved. This study remains one of the most direct demonstrations that environmental silence, or the lack of it, shapes the developing brain. Quiet is not a luxury for children. It is architecture. The Japanese aesthetic concept of ma, often translated as negative space or the interval between, describes a philosophy of silence that has influenced architecture, music, theater, and garden design for centuries. In Japanese classical music, ma refers to the pauses between notes, which are considered as compositionally significant as the notes themselves. Neuroscience has recently provided a physiological basis for this. Research in auditory processing has shown that the brain's response to a musical note continues for several hundred milliseconds after the note ends, meaning that silence is never heard as nothing. It is heard as the continuation of what just stopped. The pause is part of the sound. Flotation rest, restricted environmental stimulation therapy, involves floating in a soundproofed tank filled with high salinity water maintained at skin temperature, creating a state of near-total sensory deprivation. Clinical trials published in PLOS One in 2018 found that a single 90-minute flotation session produced reductions in anxiety, depression, and pain that persisted for at least 24 hours after the session ended. EEG recordings taken during flotation show theta brainwave dominance, the same state associated with hypnagogia and the threshold of sleep, alongside a paradoxical increase in alertness reports from subjects. In the absence of all sensation, the brain finds a particular quality of rest that is difficult to reproduce elsewhere. The sleep onset process, the neurological transition from wakefulness to sleep, requires silence-like conditions in the brain even when the bedroom itself is quiet. The ascending arousal system, which includes noradrenergic neurons in the locus coeruleus and orexin-producing neurons in the lateral hypothalamus, must downregulate before sleep can begin. Any stimulation, including the internally generated stimulation of anxious thought, keeps these systems active. Research published in Sleep Medicine Reviews identified rumination, the tendency to repetitively focus on distressing thoughts, as the single most consistent predictor of sleep onset latency across clinical populations. It is not external noise that most reliably prevents sleep. It is the noise the mind makes about itself. Being in a truly quiet environment for the first time is often described in similar terms across cultures and individuals. A sense of disorientation followed by a gradual opening. Anthropologists studying indigenous communities where nighttime quiet is the norm. No electric lighting. No ambient electronic noise. Describe the transition to sleep as more gradual and less defined than in industrialized settings. Sleep researchers have noted that pre-industrial sleep likely involved a biphasic pattern. Two distinct sleep periods separated by an hour of quiet wakefulness. That Western culture has compressed into a single block under artificial light and noise. The body remembers a different relationship with quiet than the one we currently live. Tinnitus, the perception of sound in the absence of any external source, typically experienced as ringing, buzzing, or hissing, affects approximately 15% of the adult population globally, according to the World Health Organization. For people with tinnitus, silence is not accessible in the conventional sense. Quiet environments simply make the internal sound louder. Research into tinnitus has produced unexpected insights into how the brain generates sound from nothing. The auditory cortex, deprived of its usual input by hearing loss or other damage, increases its spontaneous firing rate, essentially turning up its own gain to compensate. The brain's relationship with silence is active, not passive. It does not simply receive quiet. It produces it. Shared quiet between two people who know each other well is one of the strongest markers of relational trust and intimacy. This is what psychological research on social silence consistently finds. A study by Matthias Mail at the University of Arizona found that the capacity for comfortable silence, sitting quietly with another person without anxiety or the need to fill the space, correlated significantly with reported relationship satisfaction and perceived closeness. In contrast, people who had difficulty tolerating silence with others also reported higher levels of social anxiety and lower self-disclosure. The ability to be quiet together is not a small thing. It is how the nervous system signals safety. Noble silence in Buddhist retreat traditions. periods ranging from a single day to several months in which practitioners do not speak, has been studied empirically for its psychological effects. Research published in Psychological Science in 2011, studying participants in a 3-month retreat at the Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts, found that retreat participants showed significant increases in sustained attention, working memory capacity, and what researchers called non-reactive observation, the ability to notice thoughts without acting on them. These gains persisted for 7 months after the retreat ended. The brain's capacity for observation grows when it is no longer required to perform. Ava, the emotional state produced by encountering something vast or incomprehensible, shares significant neural overlap with the neuroscience of silence. Both states activate the anterior cingulate cortex and the default mode network in a mode researchers call self-transcendence, characterized by reduced self-referential processing and increased perception of connection to something larger than the self. Research by Daka Keltner at UC Berkeley has found that awe experiences produce reductions in inflammatory cytokines, the chemical markers of chronic stress, independent of any other psychological intervention. Standing before something too large to process, or sitting in quiet too complete to fill, produces the same neurological relief. The self stops insisting. What the first 24 facts have traced is a map of resistance. The brain that struggles with silence is not broken. It is doing what it was built to do in continuous noise and continuous demand. The mechanisms are real. The amygdala's threat scan, the DMN's autobiographical loop, the HPA axis's low-grade activation. But these mechanisms are not fixed. The brain that learned to fill silence also learns to enter it. The fear of facing yourself in quiet is not a destination. It is the starting point. How do you find peace when your mind is too loud? Not by stopping the noise, but by changing the relationship with it. That is where the next arc begins. Something is settling now. Your body knows this rhythm. A gentle subscribe lets another restless mind find this quiet place too. Let's breathe here, one sleepy soul at a time. Right now, somewhere in the thought that just arrived and the one that has not yet, there is a gap. You do not have to find it. It is already there. The question that just opened, about what the relationship with silence is made of, is not asking to be answered tonight. It is asking to be held loosely, the way the breath holds air before letting it go. Feel that. The space between inhale and exhale. That is where the facts that follow begin. Now we continue. Silence affects memory consolidation in ways that researchers are still characterizing. A study by Lila Davachi's group at New York University examined what happened in the brain during quiet rest following learning, compared to an active mental task. Using fMRI, they found that hippocampal cortical connectivity, the communication between the memory-forming hippocampus and the cortical regions that store long-term memory, was significantly stronger during quiet rest than during the distraction task. The implication was clear. the brain uses silence after learning the same way it uses sleep, to consolidate what it just received. What you allow to settle in quiet becomes part of how you remember. The space after the fact is part of the fact. Psychological silence is distinct from solitude, though the two are often confused. Solitude is a social condition, being alone, while psychological silence is an internal condition, the reduction of self-generated mental noise. Research by Esther Buchholz, drawing on attachment theory, distinguished what she called alone time, a positive state of solitary engagement that supports individuation and creativity, from loneliness, which involves the pain of unwanted separation. Psychological silence can be experienced in a crowd, and loneliness can be experienced in the quietest room. The variable is not the presence of others. It is the quality of the internal relationship with one's own thoughts. The room can be empty. The quiet cannot always be found there. The autonomic nervous system has two primary branches: the sympathetic, associated with activation and mobilization, and the parasympathetic, associated with restoration and digestion. Silence, when experienced without threat interpretation, consistently activates the parasympathetic branch. This manifests physically as decreased heart rate, slowed respiration, reduced blood pressure, and decreased muscle tension. Research analyzing dozens of studies on silence and physiological response found that the most reliable predictor of parasympathetic activation was not the type of quiet practice, meditation, nature walk, rest, but the individual's perception of safety in the silence. The body opens toward quiet only when the mind allows it to be safe. Language development research has revealed an important role for silence in early learning. Infants between the ages of 6 and 18 months process new words more accurately when they occur in speech that includes natural pauses, compared to speech with no pauses. The silent intervals give the developing auditory system time to segment the acoustic stream, to separate where one word ends and another begins. This is called statistical learning of speech segmentation, and it depends on silence, just as music depends on rests. Without the pause, the sequence becomes noise. The brain learns language not just from what it hears, but from what it is given time to process in the gaps. Silence and physical pain have a complicated relationship that researchers are still working to understand. Studies of patients with chronic pain conditions, including fibromyalgia, chronic lower back pain, and headache disorders, consistently show that these populations report higher rates of noise sensitivity and lower tolerance for quiet. For chronic pain patients, quiet environments can initially increase pain awareness, because silence removes the distraction that managed moment-to-moment pain experience. However, mindfulness-based silence practices produced the opposite result over time. By training non-reactive awareness, they reduced the emotional amplification of pain signals. The difference is between silence as absence and silence as presence. Only the second one helps. The glymphatic system, the brain's waste clearance network, discovered by Maiken Nedergaard's team at the University of Rochester in 2013, operates primarily during sleep and rest. Cerebrospinal fluid flows through channels surrounding blood vessels, washing metabolic byproducts, including amyloid beta and tau proteins from brain tissue. This process is significantly impaired by sleep disruption and, separately, by sustained sympathetic activation, the state produced by chronic noise and psychological restlessness. Silence, particularly in the pre-sleep hours, creates the physiological conditions that prepare the glymphatic system for its nightly work. A brain that is quiet before sleep cleans itself more thoroughly while it sleeps. The hygiene of the mind begins before the eyes close. Solitary animals, species that spend the majority of their lives alone, reveal that the mammalian brain has a dedicated system for regulating the psychological cost of solitude, distinct from the system that manages social bonding. In 2020, a study by Rebecca Sachs's group at MIT found that humans who spent a 10-hour period in solitary isolation showed increased activation of the substantia nigra, a dopamine-rich region associated with craving and desire, when subsequently viewing social images. The same region shows activity in hungry animals shown food. Isolation creates a drive toward connection with similar neural urgency as hunger. Something in us knows the difference between chosen alone and unwanted alone. Forest bathing, Shinrin-yoku in Japanese, was formally introduced as a public health recommendation by the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture in 1982 and has accumulated substantial supporting research. Studies by Yoshifumi Miyazaki at Chiba University compared physiological markers in participants who walked in a forest versus an urban environment. Forest walkers showed lower cortisol, lower blood pressure, lower heart rate, higher natural killer cell activity, and greater well-being. The sound environment of the forest, birdsong, wind, water, was specifically identified as restorative, distinct from visual and olfactory inputs. Natural silence is not absence. It is a frequency the nervous system was built to receive. Contemplative practices centered on silence, Quaker meeting, Zen sitting, Vipassana retreat, have been studied for their effects on biological aging markers. Telomere length tends to shorten more rapidly in individuals with high perceived stress. Research by Alyssa Epple at UC San Francisco, building on Elizabeth Blackburn's Nobel Prize-winning work, found that mindfulness and contemplative silence practices were associated with longer telomere length and higher telomerase activity compared to matched controls. The cells of people who regularly practice silence are measurably younger than the calendar would suggest. Quiet is not withdrawal. It is maintenance. Flow states, described by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi as states of effortless, deeply engaged attention, share a key feature with psychological silence: the suspension of self-referential thought. In flow, the inner critic falls quiet, the autobiographical self recedes, and action and awareness merge. EEG studies of athletes, musicians, and chess players in flow show a specific pattern called transient hypofrontality, a temporary reduction in prefrontal cortex activity that quiets the evaluative, self-monitoring functions of the brain. The same reduction is observed in experienced meditators during deep silence practice. Both flow and silence arrive at the same neurological address by different routes, a mind that has stopped performing for itself. Noise pollution research has consistently linked traffic noise exposure during sleep to elevated cardiovascular risk. A 2022 study published in European Heart Journal found that nighttime noise levels above 40 decibels, equivalent to quiet conversation, were associated with a 9% increase in cardiovascular mortality across a sample of more than 1 million European adults. The mechanism appears to involve nocturnal cortisol and adrenaline release, triggered by the noise even without full awakening. The sleeping brain monitors the acoustic environment and responds to it. The cardiovascular cost of noise during sleep is not a small thing. The heart works harder in a noisy night. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most associated with planning, self-regulation, and executive function, shows measurable fatigue after sustained periods of decision-making and focused attention. This fatigue is reduced by rest, sleep, and silence. A study at the University of Michigan found that brief exposure to natural environments, characterized by gentle, non-demanding stimuli, including natural quiet, restored directed attention capacity more effectively than urban walks. The brain's regulatory system is not a limitless resource. Silence is one of the few inputs that gives it something back rather than asking for more. Introspection, the act of turning attention inward, has a complex relationship with silence. Research by Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia, published in Science in 2014, found that a significant proportion of participants preferred to receive mild electric shocks rather than sit quietly with their own thoughts for 15 minutes. This result, replicated across multiple studies, was interpreted as evidence of how uncomfortable, unguided self-reflection can be for many people. What subsequent research clarified, however, was that the discomfort was not with introspection per se, but with unstructured introspection, the absence of any framework for relating to what arose. Silence without skill feels like threat. Silence with practice feels like home. Social psychologists studying the experience of being ignored, a phenomenon called the silent treatment or social ostracism, have found it to be one of the most psychologically painful interpersonal experiences humans can undergo. Research by Kipling Williams at Purdue University using the cyberball paradigm found that even being excluded from a ball-tossing game by strangers on a computer for less than 5 minutes produced significant reductions in feelings of belonging, self-esteem, and perceived control. The brain's response to being silenced by others registers in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the same region activated by physical pain. But what is taken away can also be chosen, and that changes everything the brain does with it. A pattern is now visible across tonight's first 2 arcs. Silence is not one thing. It is a landscape with many different terrains. The silence of a near soundless room and the silence of the forest produce different neurological responses. The silence of chosen solitude and the silence of imposed exclusion activate different circuits. What tonight is building toward? The question that started where this one did, with discomfort in the quiet, is not an answer about silence itself. It is an answer about the psychological stance taken toward it. That stance is what the second half examines. There's a quietness settling in now, the kind that comes when you've been listening for a while and the body has started to let go of the day. Just notice that. We're exploring the mind's own relationship with stillness, the very instrument doing the exploring. And we'll keep going, slowly. Self-compassion provides an important bridge between silence and psychological well-being. This is what a growing body of research from Kristin Neff at the University of Texas at Austin consistently finds. Self-compassionate individuals, those who relate to their own suffering with warmth rather than judgment, show lower cortisol reactivity to stress, faster recovery from negative events, and healthier sleep patterns. Self-compassion practice consistently involves a component of stillness, the instruction to simply sit with what is present without needing to fix it. What research shows is that the healing mechanism is not the absence of difficult thought, but the presence of a non-judgmental witness to it. Silence, in this frame, is not emptiness. It is company. Some people enter silence more easily than others, and psychological absorption helps explain why. Absorption is the tendency to become deeply immersed in imaginative or sensory experiences, and it correlates significantly with meditative depth and hypnotic responsiveness. High absorbers report easier access to meditative silence and stronger restorative response to quiet environments. Research found that absorption was positively correlated with creative achievement, emotional intelligence, and the ability to find meaning in ordinary experience. People who can absorb themselves in something simple, a single sound, a breath, a sensation, tend to find silence less threatening than those who cannot. The anterior cingulate cortex plays a central role in the psychological experience of silence by modulating what researchers call conflict monitoring, the detection of discrepancy between what is happening and what was expected. In quiet environments, the ACC does not simply shut down. It continues scanning for mismatches, but in the absence of external input, the mismatches it monitors are internal. The gap between how one feels and how one thinks one should feel. The distance between present experience and anticipated experience. This internal conflict monitoring is the neural substrate of what meditators describe as the wanting mind, the part that cannot accept the present moment as it is. The ACC quiets when the wanting quiets. Awe in silence, specifically the awe produced by vast natural environments or profound stillness, has physiological effects that distinguish it from ordinary relaxation. A 2015 study by Jennifer Stella at UC Berkeley measured inflammatory cytokines in participants who reported awe experiences. Awe was the single emotion most strongly associated with lower levels of interleukin-6, a pro-inflammatory marker, The silence in which awe typically occurs is not incidental to its effect. The physical scale of what produces awe and the quiet that surrounds it appear to work together on the nervous system in ways that ordinary calm cannot replicate. Music psychology has long studied the role of silence within musical structure. The composer Arnold Schoenberg described musical silence as the loudest sound there is, a phrase researchers in music cognition have since investigated empirically. An EEG study found that when a musical phrase ends and silence follows, the brain continues generating expectation responses for up to 800 milliseconds, projecting what should come next into the gap. This projection mechanism is the same one that fills the quiet before sleep with anticipatory thought. The mind does not wait passively in silence. It populates it. Understanding this is the first step toward working with it rather than against it. Sound-induced sleep disruption operates through both the cortical arousal system and what researchers call subcortical processing, the brain's monitoring of the acoustic environment below conscious awareness. Studies using polysomnography have found that sounds as quiet as 33 decibels, well below conversational volume, produce measurable cortical arousals during sleep without the sleeper awakening or reporting any disturbance. These micro-arousals reduce slow-wave sleep and impair the memory consolidation that depends on it. A person sleeping in a nominally quiet room with a ceiling fan or distant traffic is not sleeping in silence. They are sleeping in a noise environment the brain is processing all night. True acoustic quiet produces measurably deeper and more restorative sleep. Among the most consistent findings in the psychology of attention is the connection between ADHD and silence intolerance. Children and adults with ADHD show reliably higher levels of sensation-seeking behavior in quiet environments. The impulse to generate stimulation when external stimulation is absent. This is understood in part as a compensatory mechanism. The dopaminergic system in ADHD is chronically understimulated in quiet environments, so the individual creates their own noise to maintain alertness. Mindfulness-based silence practices adapted for ADHD populations. Shorter, structured, with clear sensory anchors, show significant reductions in hyperactivity and inattention scores after 8 weeks. The brain that struggles most with silence may also benefit most from carefully entering it. Chanting, in traditions from Gregorian to Vedic to Tibetan, functions in part as a bridge to silence. The rhythmic, repetitive nature of chanting synchronizes the brain's hemispheres, a state called interhemispheric coherence, and simultaneously slows respiration and heart rate through sustained exhalation. Research published in the International Journal of Yoga found that chanting produces a gradual shift from beta to alpha to theta brainwave states, the same shift that silence produces, but through sound rather than its absence. The most common instruction across chanting traditions is to rest in the silence after the final note. The sound was preparation for the quiet it creates. White noise, broadband sound that masks environmental acoustic fluctuation, reveals a paradox when studied carefully. For some populations, including children with learning disabilities and adults with certain ADHD profiles. It actually improves cognitive performance on tasks requiring sustained attention. The proposed mechanism, called stochastic resonance, suggests that a small amount of background noise can enhance the signal-to-noise ratio in neural processing, helping weak signals cross the detection threshold. The optimal acoustic environment for a given brain varies considerably by individual neurotype. The nervous system is not asking for silence. It is asking for the right absence. At this midpoint, the central question, how do you find peace when your mind is too loud, has revealed something unexpected. The mind's noise is not always the enemy. The same mechanisms that generate inner speech scan for threat in silence and fill quiet with anticipation are also responsible for creativity, memory consolidation, and the brain's ability to care for itself. What the second half of tonight follows is not how to eliminate the noise, but how to shift the relationship with it. The question is not why the mind is loud. The question is what the mind is protecting when it refuses to let silence in, and what becomes possible when it finally does. What just opened? The question of what the mind is protecting when it will not allow silence is not only a cognitive question. You may be carrying a version of it right now. Something in you that has learned, over time, that quiet is the place where the difficult things surface. That is not a flaw in how you are built. That is intelligence that has not yet learned it is safe to rest. Notice your breath. The body keeps moving through everything the mind holds. The second half of tonight follows what happens when that safety begins to arrive. Now we continue. Experiential avoidance, the tendency to suppress or escape unwanted internal experiences, is one of the most robust predictors of psychological distress across clinical populations. Research by Stephen Hayes. The foundational work behind acceptance and commitment therapy has consistently shown that attempting to eliminate internal experience increases its intensity and persistence. Silence is the environment in which avoided experience becomes most audible. Sitting with silence is, in part, learning that what the mind contains can be encountered without being controlled, and that the encounter, contrary to expectation, does not destroy. Equanimity, the quality of psychological stability in the face of difficult experience, has a specific neural signature. Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison found that highly trained meditators showed significantly shorter amygdala activation in response to aversive stimuli compared to novice meditators and non-meditators. The amygdala still fired. It registered threat, but the return to baseline was dramatically faster in experienced practitioners. Davidson called this emotional resilience. What silence practice builds, over time, is not the absence of emotional response, but the speed of recovery. The storms do not stop. The settling afterward grows faster. Silence and grief have a relationship documented across cultures and psychological traditions. George Bonanno at Columbia University, studying resilient bereavement, the ability to recover from profound loss without developing complicated grief, identifies one consistent factor: the capacity to move between emotional engagement and respite without resistance. Silence appears in this research as a container for grief rather than an avoidance of it, a space where the intensity of loss can be met without the need to perform or explain it. People who find it hard to be silent with grief tend to carry it longer. The ones who can sit with the quiet carry it differently. Something Peter Fonagy's work on mentalization has revealed is that the capacity to hold one's own mental states and those of others with curiosity rather than reactivity, a capacity central to healthy relationships, requires a kind of internal silence, a pause before response. Adults who mentalize well show lower impulsivity, higher empathic accuracy, and better relationship stability. The internal silence that enables mentalization is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of observation before reaction. You may already know this. It lives in the moment between hearing something difficult and choosing what you do next. Ancient sacred space, Stonehenge, Maltese Hipoja, Greek oracles, Tibetan monastic halls, have been studied by archaeoacousticians, including Rupert Till at Huddersfield. These structures share a consistent property. They amplify resonant frequencies while producing long reverb tails. Standing in these spaces and speaking produces an experience of the voice continuing after it has stopped, sound dissolving into silence gradually. Researchers proposed this design was intentional, a built environment that made audible the transition from sound to silence, as if the two were not opposites but neighbors. You may already know this. The way a conversation ends and leaves something still vibrating. Earworms, the involuntary experience of a song repeating in the mind, are understood in cognitive neuroscience as the brain's predictive processing system overrunning the absence of input. When silence falls after music, the auditory cortex continues generating the expected acoustic pattern from memory, filling the quiet with what was just there. This is particularly relevant to sleep. The transition from audio content to silence before bed can temporarily increase earworm activity. Gradual, acoustic fade, rather than abrupt silence, supports smoother sleep onset for people prone to involuntary musical imagery. The mind doesn't stop at the last note. It follows what it expected to hear next. What researchers call the cocktail party effect, the brain's remarkable ability to isolate a single voice from a noisy environment, reveals how selective auditory attention works. The auditory cortex creates an auditory scene, parsing the environment into distinct sources and attending selectively. What this reveals about silence is counterintuitive. In noise, selective attention requires ongoing active suppression of non-attended streams, a significant cognitive load. In silence, this suppression cost disappears entirely. The cognitive resource freed by acoustic quiet is not trivial. It is the difference between a system running with and without a significant background load. Tibetan Buddhist philosophy names two forms of silence. The first is the quieting of sensory input and thought. The second is recognizing the nature of mind itself, open, prior to content. This distinction maps onto a contemporary neuroscience division between access consciousness, the reportable contents of experience, and phenomenal consciousness, the underlying quality of awareness. The meditation traditions have long suggested that the second form of silence, awareness, aware of itself, is qualitatively different from thought simply going quiet. Both traditions point to something the other only partially sees. You may have touched the second kind tonight, without naming it. Introversion and silence have a relationship that is both robust and nuanced. Brian Little at Cambridge distinguishes between biological introversion, the greater baseline cortical arousal that makes introverts prefer less external stimulation, and social introversion, the preference for smaller social environments. For biologically introverted individuals, quiet environments are not just preferred, but physiologically necessary. High stimulation pushes their arousal toward an aversive peak more quickly than it does for extroverts. What neuroscience adds is that this is not a preference, but a nervous system characteristic. An introvert in a noisy environment is not being antisocial. They are managing a genuine biological cost. Silence during psychotherapy has been studied as a therapeutic event in its own right. Research by Peter Knappen and colleagues found that therapist-initiated silence, moments when the therapist chooses not to speak in response to the client, is experienced by clients in sharply different ways, depending on the therapeutic alliance. In high alliance relationships, silence is experienced as companionate, as space for reflection, as evidence of the therapist's trust in the client's capacity to find their own meaning. In low alliance relationships, the same silence is experienced as abandonment, judgment, or incompetence. The silence itself is neutral. What the relationship brings to it determines everything. Sensory gating, the brain's ability to filter and reduce responses to repeated, non-threatening stimuli, shows that the nervous system learns to suppress its response to predictable sounds over time. This is why we stop hearing the air conditioning or distant traffic. Sensory gating explains why people in noisy environments can sleep well despite conditions that disturb newcomers. What it also means is that silence can initially increase arousal in people accustomed to noise. The brain has been using background sound as a reference signal, and its sudden absence triggers an orienting response. The quiet room feels louder than the noisy one at first. Sleep mentation, the mental activity during sleep, including dreaming and hypnagogic imagery, is quieter in structure than waking thought, not louder. REM sleep cognition, despite its vivid imagery, shows reduced prefrontal cortex activity, the seat of self-monitoring and inner speech, and increased limbic and visual cortex activity. The dreaming brain is already practicing a form of psychological silence, experiencing and responding without the evaluative narrative of waking thought. Sleep is not simply rest. It is a nightly rehearsal of what it means to be without the inner critic. There is a moment, sometimes just a few seconds long, between hearing something difficult and responding to it. Dialectical behavior therapy calls the capacity to find and inhabit that moment wise mind, an integrated state in which emotional experience and rational analysis coexist without either dominating. In DBT practice, accessing wise mind typically involves a brief moment of silence, a pause in which the individual stops doing to notice what they already know. Research on DBT efficacy consistently finds this capacity for brief internal pause to be one of the most predictive factors of treatment success. It is, in some frameworks, the central skill. Compassion fatigue, the emotional and physical exhaustion experienced by caregivers, healthcare workers, and first responders, has the absence of recovery time as its primary driver. Recovery requires entering restorative states characterized by low cognitive demand and low acoustic stimulation. Studies of nurse burnout found that access to quiet rest spaces during shifts, rooms designed for minimal sensory input, was one of the most effective institutional interventions for reducing burnout and improving retention. Even the ones who carry others need something to carry them. A principle has emerged through tonight's journey. The mind's resistance to silence is proportional to the mind's need for it. The clinical populations that struggle most with quiet, those with anxiety, ADHD, trauma histories, chronic stress, are also those for whom silence practice shows the largest therapeutic benefit over time. That initial resistance is not a sign that silence will harm you. It is a sign that the nervous system has been working very hard, for a very long time, and does not yet believe it is safe to stop. Tonight, that belief has been changing. Post-traumatic growth is associated with a specific cognitive process that researchers call deliberate rumination, the intentional, constructive reflection on a difficult experience, as opposed to the intrusive replay that characterizes PTSD. Studies by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun found that deliberate rumination most often occurred during quiet states, long walks, sleepless nights, periods of solitude, and was the single strongest predictor of post-traumatic growth across populations. The silence in which people worked through their hardest experiences is not incidental to the working through. It is the medium in which integration becomes possible. Something the brain does quietly, long after the event, is begin to revise the story. This is the neuroscience of forgiveness, the downregulation of limbic reactivity to memories of past harm, mediated by the prefrontal cortex. Research by Fred Luskin at Stanford found that forgiveness interventions produced measurable reductions in cortisol, blood pressure, and self-reported anger that persisted over time. What practitioners of contemplative forgiveness consistently describe as essential is silence, the willingness to sit with the weight of what happened without either defending against it or being consumed by it. The prefrontal cortex does its deepest work in the quiet of witnessing. Liminality, the psychological state of being between two stable identities or ways of being, is consistently described in research as a period of increased silence seeking. Anthropologist Victor Turner, who coined the term, described liminal states as characterized by withdrawal from ordinary social noise and immersion in a quieter engagement with existence. Contemporary research on major life transitions finds that individuals who voluntarily seek silence during transitional periods report better adjustment outcomes than those who use social distraction. The quiet between one chapter and the next is not lost time. It is the writing of the next sentence. The immune system has a direct relationship with psychological silence. Natural killer cells, the immune system's primary defense against viral infection, show measurable increases in activity following contemplative silence practices. A study published in Psychosomatic Medicine found that retreat participants showed elevated NK cell activity and reduced inflammatory markers compared to a waiting list control group. The mechanism involves reduced sympathetic nervous system activation, which in chronic stress suppresses immune function. The body's defenses are not separate from the mind's relationship with quiet. The immune system breathes more freely in the silence. Quiet attentiveness is where the experience of meaningful coincidence, what Carl Jung called synchronicity, is most commonly reported. Contemporary cognitive science does not validate synchronicity as an external phenomenon, but does validate the attentional conditions in which it tends to be noticed. When the mind is quiet and not actively task-focused, it enters a more diffuse processing mode that increases sensitivity to pattern and connection. What appears to be a meaningful coincidence is often the quieted mind noticing something it would have missed in noise. Silence does not create meaning. It removes the interference that was obscuring it. Still presence, a quality of open, quiet receptivity, is consistently identified in the neuroscience of love as central to the deepest experiences of connection. Studies of sustained eye contact between intimate partners show synchronized cardiac and respiratory activity, EEG coherence, and the activation of reward circuits in both individuals. The quality of attention involved in this connection is not effortful. It allows the other person to be fully received. What the neuroscience of love suggests is that the capacity for deep connection depends on the same interior silence that meditation describes. Presence is quiet attentiveness made into relationship. Noise-induced learned helplessness, developing in individuals chronically exposed to uncontrollable aversive noise, has been studied as a model for understanding depression. Martin Seligman found that the critical variable was not the aversiveness of the stimulus, but the absence of control. Animals and humans who had no means of escaping noise showed reduced motivation, impaired problem solving, and depressive behavior that persisted after the noise stopped. Controllable silence, freely chosen, is neurologically the opposite of learned helplessness. Agency over one's acoustic environment is a form of psychological freedom. Somatic psychology, the study of how psychological processes are held in the body, has illuminated the relationship between silence and embodied experience. Peter Levine describes the body as a repository of unprocessed experience, accessible only through internal silence. an inward-turning attention that does not evaluate what it finds. Research on somatic therapies consistently shows improvements in interoceptive awareness, reduced hypervigilance, and improved sleep quality in participants who learn to attend to the body with quiet curiosity rather than control. The body has been waiting for the mind to go quiet. Studies across traditions without historical contact have found remarkable consistency in descriptions of contemplative silence. Christian mystical silence, Sufi fana, Buddhist emptiness, and Hindu samadhi share a common core: the dissolution of the subject-object boundary, the suspension of time, and a quality of presence described as more real than ordinary experience. William James, in The Varieties of Religious Experience, identified this as the noetic quality of mystical states, the feeling of having genuinely learned something, even if no discursive thought was present. The deepest knowing, across traditions, arrives in quiet. What tonight's facts have made clear is that silence is not the absence of psychological resistance. It is the recognition that the resistance was never necessary. The mind that fears silence and the mind that rests in it are not different minds. They are the same mind at different points on the same arc. Research across neuroscience, clinical psychology, and contemplative science converges on one principle. The nervous system, given genuine permission to rest, moves toward quiet naturally. It does not need to be forced. It needs to believe it is safe. The remaining facts carry that belief forward. What follows is simpler and closer. Something is lighter now. Not because the questions stopped, but because they have been met long enough that they no longer need answering tonight. Feel the weight of your body, the places where it rests against the surface beneath you. The breath still finding its own pace, slower now than it was an hour ago. You do not have to keep arriving. You are already here. There is nothing further you are expected to understand tonight. The facts have done what facts do, pointed towards something that only stillness can finish. We will continue with the final facts. Silence softens the edges of time. People who practice meditative silence consistently report that their subjective experience of duration changes. An hour in quiet practice feels simultaneously shorter and longer than an hour in activity. Research in temporal perception has confirmed that the subjective expansion of time in still, attentive states is related to the density of experience rather than its content. In silence, more is noticed per unit of clock time. The present moment grows wider. The breath is the body's built-in bridge to silence. Every exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system slightly more than the inhale activates the sympathetic. Extended exhalation, breathing out longer than breathing in, shifts the autonomic balance toward rest measurably and quickly. This is not a technique invented by meditation. It is a mechanism the body has always had. Silence, when it coincides with slow breath, compounds the effect Neuroimaging research shows that the brains of long-term meditators have more gray matter in the insular cortex, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex than age-matched controls. Gray matter density correlates with functional capacity. The brain does not thin in the direction of silence. It thickens. Years of sitting quietly leave a physical record in the architecture of the mind, a structure built from attention, again and again, returning to the present. The word quiet comes from the Latin quietus, meaning at rest, free from disturbance, at peace. The same root gives us acquit, to free from a charge, and quite, completely, entirely. In its etymology, quiet carries the meaning of being done, released from what was held against you, free from obligation, fully arrived. The language knew something about silence long before the neuroscience did. Keeping a gratitude journal before bed, reviewing the day with appreciative attention, noticing what was good, reduces pre-sleep cognitive arousal and decreases the time it takes to fall asleep. The mechanism is not simply positive thinking. It is the quieting of the brain's threat detection system through the deliberate redirection of attention. Gratitude practice and silence practice point in the same neurological direction. The body's pain threshold rises slightly during meditation. Studies using heat pain and cold pressor tasks have found that meditators tolerate discomfort longer and rate it as less unpleasant than non-meditators. Even when physiological measures of sensation are identical, the difference is not that they feel less. It is that they resist what they feel less. Silence changes the relationship with sensation without changing the sensation itself. Children who are given regular, quiet time in school, unstructured periods with no screens, no noise, no assigned activity, show improved executive function scores compared to those without it. The finding, replicated in several Scandinavian educational studies, suggests that the developing brain benefits from scheduled nothing, not stimulation, not learning content, simply space. The nervous system uses what it is given when what it is given includes room to breathe. Silence in the presence of a trusted other, what attachment researchers call quiet companionship, is associated with oxytocin release, the neuropeptide most associated with social bonding and trust. Being quietly present with another person without the performance of conversation is a form of intimacy that activates the same biological circuitry as more active expressions of care. The body does not require words to feel held. Silence and creative output have a consistent relationship in the lives of writers, composers, and visual artists. Interviews conducted by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in his landmark study of creative individuals found that nearly all of them described periods of deliberate silence and withdrawal as essential prerequisites to their most significant work, not as procrastination, but as preparation. The work did not happen despite the quiet. It happened because of it. The 15 minutes immediately following vigorous physical activity are among the most neurologically fertile periods of the day. Elevated dopamine, norepinephrine, and BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, often called fertilizer for neurons, combine with the parasympathetic rebound that follows exertion to create a brief window of heightened neuroplasticity. Silence during this window allows the brain's own restorative chemistry to do its work without interference. The quieting of inner speech before sleep is associated with a characteristic shift in the content of mental activity, from propositional thought, which has the structure of language, to imagistic thought, which is perceptual and nonverbal. This shift accompanies the transition into hypnagogia and is one of the signatures of healthy sleep onset. People who remain in verbal internal dialogue longer before sleep take longer to fall asleep. The mind leaves language last as it moves toward rest. Silence is not the beginning of the journey towards sleep. It is the final step. Somewhere on this planet, there are still places where nothing human interrupts the quiet for a full hour. Acoustic ecologist Gordon Hempton has spent decades recording them and identified fewer than 12 such locations in the continental United States. The rarity of this kind of quiet is a measurable loss. The nervous system evolved in a world where it was ordinary. What is now exceptional was once daily. Surrender, the release of the need to control or resolve, is described in both clinical and contemplative literature as a prerequisite for the deepest forms of rest. Surrender is the active recognition that not everything needs to be carried consciously. Research on acceptance-based therapies finds that willingness to stop fighting inner experience, to allow thoughts and feelings to pass without clinging or pushing, produces more stable well-being outcomes than effortful control. Silence is one of the few environments where surrender becomes possible. The sound of rain, a natural masking soundscape used by millions to help them sleep, works in part by providing what auditory researchers call predictable unpredictability, a pattern of white noise with subtle natural variation that the brain processes as safe and non-threatening. It satisfies the orienting response without triggering it. The popularity of rain sounds for sleep reflects the nervous system's ancient familiarity with precipitation as an indicator of a stable, non-predatory environment. The rain says, "Nothing is hunting tonight." What mindfulness-based stress reduction has found after 4 decades is this. The most consistent predictor of benefit is not the specific technique practiced, but the regularity of practice. Brief, daily periods of silence, as short as 10 minutes, produce cumulative, structural, and functional brain changes that longer but infrequent sessions do not. The silence that helps is not the heroic silence. It is the quiet kept, small and steady, returned to again and again like a doorway the body learns to recognize. The ocean at night produces what researchers describe as its lowest, broadest frequency, deep, slow, near the edge of conscious hearing, as large swells pass through without breaking. Researchers suggest this low frequency may register in the nervous system as a slow, rhythmic pressure. People who live near the ocean consistently report falling asleep faster and sleeping more deeply. The body may feel what it cannot quite hear. Active forgetting. The brain's process of releasing irrelevant or emotionally processed information is now understood as essential to healthy memory function. Michael Anderson has shown that suppression of unwanted memories is a real neurological process, mediated by prefrontal downregulation of hippocampal retrieval. Sleep, and the silence that precedes it, support this forgetting as much as they support remembering. A well-rested brain forgets what it no longer needs. The mind that rests in silence is not holding everything. It is quietly releasing what no longer serves. Long-term contemplative silence practice is associated with measurable increases in what the Big Five personality model calls openness to experience, a trait linked to intellectual curiosity, aesthetic sensitivity, and comfort with ambiguity. People who practice silence regularly over years become more comfortable with not knowing, more receptive to perspectives different from their own, and more tolerant of complexity. The quiet that began as a practice becomes a disposition. The nervous system that learned to rest in uncertainty also learns to live there. Silence in nature during the transition between day and night, what naturalists call the crepuscular hour, produces a specific physiological response tied to the synchronization of circadian rhythms with the light-dark cycle. As natural light fades and the acoustic environment of diurnal species gives way to the sounds of nocturnal ones, melatonin secretion begins to rise. The quieting of the world at dusk is not metaphorical. It is biological. The evening silence is the body's invitation, extended again each night, to follow the day into rest. The most profound psychological effect of sustained silence practice is a shift in the relationship with the self. Not the elimination of the self, but its decentralization. The self becomes less like a pressure point and more like a landscape. Thoughts still arise, emotions still move, sensations still register. But they arise in something wider than they can fill. This is what tonight has been tracing. A mind that has learned it does not have to hold everything tightly in order to hold it well. The last hour of a sleep cycle is the most REM-rich. During this final hour, the brain consolidates emotional memory, processes the day's relational and narrative material, and produces the vivid dreaming most associated with creative insight. People who shorten their sleep by even 1 hour, and nearly always from the end of the night, disproportionately lose this final arc of processing. What is lost is not merely sleep time. It is the hour in which the mind finishes what the day started. Tonight, that hour is whole. Silence, held with warmth rather than effort, eventually changes the quality of thought that arises within it. The anxious planning, the replaying of conversations, the what-ifs, these do not disappear immediately. But over time, in a mind regularly returned to quiet, they thin. The thoughts that survive the silence are the thoughts that matter. What is most true, most necessary, most aligned with what is actually valued. This remains when the noise falls away. Silence is not a subtraction, it is a clarification. The brain undergoes its most significant consolidation of the day's emotional experience during the first 90 minutes of sleep. Slow-wave sleep, which dominates this initial period, processes declarative memory and provides the physiological conditions for emotional downregulation. The reduction of the cortisol and amygdala activation that accumulated during the day's demands. The quiet that precedes sleep is not separate from this process. It is the preparation. The gentler the mind when sleep arrives, the deeper into restoration the first slow-wave cycle can descend. Tonight's quiet is already working. What silence offers is not peace as an achievement. It arrives in the pause between one thought and the next, the space that was always there, that was never absent, that the noise simply covered. The mind does not need to be emptied to be quiet. It needs to be seen clearly enough that what it contains can rest without being driven. Tonight has been that kind of seeing. One fact, one breath, one small surrender at a time. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of psychological resistance. This is the answer tonight has been building toward, from the first minutes when the quiet felt uncomfortable, through the arc tracing how the brain learned to fill silence with threat, to the recognition that the noise was protection before it was obstacle. The silence was not empty. It was full of what had been here all along, waiting for the noise to thin enough to be heard. Rest now. The resistance was never necessary. 100 facts ago, the quiet in this room felt like something to be managed. We followed the amygdala, scanning an empty room for threat. The default mode network, filling silence with autobiography. The HPA axis holding its low-grade vigilance even when nothing demanded it. We watched how the nervous system learned to treat the absence of noise as an absence of safety. And then we watched it change. What began as a question about why the mind gets loud when the world goes quiet became something closer to an answer about what the mind has been protecting all along. Tonight, the protection was not needed. The quiet held. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of psychological resistance. You carry something different now than you did at the beginning of tonight. Not a technique, and not a resolution, but a small, lived experience that the quiet did not consume you. That is the first evidence the nervous system needs. And it remembers. Perhaps tonight's quiet brought your mind somewhere it hasn't been able to rest in a while. If this space helped, a gentle like or subscribe helps another restless mind find its way here too. Another tired person who hasn't yet discovered that silence is safe. One quiet tap, one sleepy soul at a time. Right now, the orienting response that scanned this room for threat at the beginning of tonight has gone still. Not because nothing is here, because what is here has been recognized, again and again, as safe. Let your entire being dissolve into that recognition. The resistance that felt so necessary 100 facts ago was never between you and sleep. It was between you and the belief that it was safe to let go. You have let go, a little, tonight. That is enough. That is everything. You can allow these thoughts to settle now, like sound finally reaching the end of its reverb, the room having held it long enough. Let the weight of your body release into whatever is beneath you. If sleep comes, let it take you to the place where the mind rests without needing to understand what it's resting in. The Psychology for Sleep playlist has spent many hours in this territory. The space where what we carry is examined quietly enough that the carrying gets lighter. The next hour follows the part of tonight's question that this one didn't have time to finish. That hour is waiting whenever you are ready. But if your eyes are closed, stay there. Rest well, quiet one. The resistance has already ended. Where science becomes the softest place to rest. Good night.